In 2024, the entire world thought it was watching a rap battle. What the world was actually watching was something far more surgical, and Kendrick Lamar was the operator holding the scalpel. This wasn't music. This was a psychological execution broadcast in broad daylight, and the terrifying part is that most of the audience is still trying to understand what they actually saw. How does one artist convince the entire music industry to quietly step away from the biggest commercial force on the planet, without ever raising his voice, without ever moving faster than necessary, and without ever letting the mask slip for a single frame? The answer has almost nothing to do with rap. It has everything to do with the weaponization of restraint, the surgical use of silence, and the moment a billionaire's own ego was turned into the loaded gun pointed back at his own temple. Kendrick Lamar didn't out-rap Drake. Kendrick Lamar outthought Drake. And if that sentence unsettles you, good, it should, because by the time this file is finished, you will understand that what unfolded across those 49 days in the spring of 2024 was one of the most calculated dismantlings of a public figure ever executed live on the timeline, and the machinery behind it is still humming under the surface of the culture in 2026. It is still shaping release schedules. It is still shaping label decisions. It is still bleeding into the way every major artist thinks about the difference between attention and respect. Welcome back to the unseen play. This is the file we have been holding for the exact right moment, and today is that moment. We are going to walk, step by step, through the invisible warfare that surrounded a Machiavellian empire, that isolated a man from every angle he thought was fortified, and that ended with the world's most streamed artist filing a $100 million appeal against his own record label because the ground beneath him had already been salted. And if you rode this all the way in with me, you know the deal. Give the video a like, subscribe if you have not already, because what we are about to lay out is the kind of story YouTube would rather you never sat down and thought about clearly, and the more we push together, the further the truth travels. To understand a collapse of this magnitude, you have to understand the two archetypes that collided, because a war like this does not happen between equals. It happens between opposites. On one side of the board sits Kendrick Lamar. A kid who watched a friend die before he ever released a debut album. A survivor of Compton block warfare who converted his trauma into the only Pulitzer Prize in hip-hop history. A stoic who spent years in real therapy, working through survivor's guilt so intimately that he could later use those exact same tools of introspection to autopsy someone else in front of a global audience. A man who built his creative empire on a single philosophy that most rappers never even consider, that the truth, spoken slowly and precisely, cuts deeper than any bar delivered at full volume. On the other side of the board sits Drake, and Drake is not the character his marketing team pretends he is. Drake is a corporate operator. A former television actor from a wealthy Toronto pocket, a man who did not build his empire through vulnerability, but through market suppression, algorithmic saturation, and the surgical use of media relationships to smother any narrative that competed with his own. He is a Machiavellian in the most literal, dictionary-accurate sense of the word. His genius is capital. His weapon is the release schedule. His empire is the algorithm itself. And the reason he lost this war is the same reason every emperor eventually loses. Absolute power builds a psychological blind spot. Drake's need for validation, his obsessive appetite for public affirmation, was the single doorway Kendrick needed to walk through, and Drake propped it open himself with his own two hands. Every real war starts with a miscalculation, and this one started with a compliment that was actually a coronation attempt in disguise. For over a decade, Kendrick and Drake had circled each other in Cold War formation. Subliminal shots, coded references, mutual respect performed for public consumption while everything underneath it corroded. That balance held until October 2023, when Drake and J. Cole released First Person Shooter, and on that record J. Cole lit the fuse he probably did not fully understand he was lighting. Cole declared the three of them, himself, Drake, and Kendrick, the big three of the modern rap era. To a corporate mind like Drake's, sharing a throne is a portfolio move. It is diversification. It is brand alignment. It is good business. To a stoic from Compton who spent his entire creative life bleeding onto records to earn every syllable of authenticity, being categorized alongside a pop crossover product with a manufactured street persona was not a compliment. It was an insult framed as flattery. It was a corporate merger proposal pretending to be a friendly toast. And Kendrick, being Kendrick, said nothing. He waited 5 months. He watched the culture accept the framing. he watched the industry nod along. And in that silence, he built a trap. March 22, 2024. Kendrick Lamar surfaces on Metro Boomin and Future's album, on a track called Like That, and he does not perform a diss. He performs an amputation. In 16 bars, Kendrick removes the concept of the big three from the conversation entirely, and he does it without heat, without theatrics, without a single visible sign of the emotional temperature the ambush required. He simply informs the room that there is one seat at the top of the game, and that seat has an occupant. That verse was not the attack. That verse was the trap. It was bait, calibrated with sniper-level precision to the exact psychological profile of the man Kendrick wanted to bring into the open. And Drake, being the algorithmic emperor who cannot afford to lose control of the narrative for even a single news cycle, walked right into it with both feet. Now hold this thought, because this is where the psychology of the entire war reveals itself. When you attack an amateur, he reacts inside minutes. When you attack a master, he controls the tempo. Drake reacted. That was the tell. On April 13, a leaked track called Push-Ups hit the internet, and Drake threw the arsenal. He mocked Kendrick Lamar's height. He mocked Kendrick's shoe size. He ridiculed Kendrick's arrangement with his label, pointing out publishing splits like they were a scandal instead of a routine industry contract. The Drake fanbase erupted. The metrics looked healthy. The engagement graph spiked into the red. But Kendrick did not respond. 6 full days passed. Silence. And in that silence, Drake made the single biggest strategic error of his entire career. He panicked. He released a secret track called Tailor-Made Freestyle, and on it he used artificial intelligence-generated vocal replicas of Tupac Shakur and Snoop Dogg to try to bait Kendrick into a response. Think about what that gesture actually says. It says a man with a $2 billion catalog, an untouchable label deal, and a decade of chart dominance is so unsettled by 6 days of quiet that he needs to summon the ghosts of dead legends through machine imitation to force a reaction out of one man on the other coast. Drake did not realize it, but he had already lost. He had shown the room where the pressure point lived. He had drawn a map to his own nervous system and handed it to Kendrick with a bow on top. In military strategy there is a principle called isolation. You separate your enemy from their supply lines, their communications, and their psychological composure, and then you wait. Kendrick Lamar understood isolation on an instinctive, almost cellular level. He weaponized the void. To the public, it looked like nothing was happening. In reality, it was the loudest silence in music industry history. He let Drake exhaust his own ammunition. He let Drake tire his own arm out. He let Drake look thirsty for engagement in front of an audience that was starting, slowly and then all at once, to notice the imbalance. Every day of Kendrick's quiet was a day Drake's fans defended him louder, and every day the defense got louder, the desperation got more visible. This is a lesson every operator in the modern attention economy needs to internalize. Restraint is not passivity. Restraint is a weapon. And Kendrick was aiming it directly at the artery of Drake's public image. April 30, 2024. The silence broke. Kendrick released Euphoria, a nearly 7-minute track, cut into 3 distinct sonic movements, and the moment it dropped, everyone paying real attention understood that this was not a diss track. This was an autopsy. And here is the thing you have to understand about the person performing the autopsy. Kendrick did not arrive at this level of surgical precision by accident, and he did not arrive at it by natural gift alone. Years earlier, he had lost 3 close friends to street violence, and he carried what psychologists call survivor's guilt, the quiet, corrosive belief that he did not deserve to make it out of Compton when the people beside him didn't. He spent years, in real therapy, working through that grief in structured clinical sessions. That work became the foundation of an entire album, laid bare in front of the world, and that album stripped him down in front of everyone before he ever stripped anyone else. Which means that by the time Kendrick Lamar sat down to disassemble Drake, he had already performed the exact same procedure on himself. He was not operating on a stranger. He was operating with the calm of a surgeon who had once been the patient. He knew exactly where to cut because he had already survived the cut. Kendrick did not try to rap harder than Drake. He did not try to punch bar for bar. He stepped into the role of a clinical therapist reviewing a patient's file. He opened Euphoria by naming Drake a scam artist rather than a rap artist, and that single reframing rewired the entire war. He attacked the machinery of Drake's identity. He picked apart the radio-friendly hooks, the algorithmic release pattern, the pathological habit of adjusting personas to fit rooms, the infatuation with acting tough while dressing in luxury. He pointed at the tragic irony sitting at the core of Drake's existence, a man trying to purchase the respect of a culture he never had to survive to enter. And then Kendrick said, with a coldness you rarely hear in commercial music, that he hated the way Drake walked, the way Drake talked, and the way Drake dressed. The dismantling had begun, and the tools were not punchlines. They were mirrors. Kendrick did not want to embarrass Drake. Kendrick wanted Drake to see himself, and he wanted Drake to see himself while the entire world watched over his shoulder. Then came the weekend that will be studied in journalism schools and behavioral psychology programs for the next 30 years. The most violent 48 hours in the recorded history of the genre. Morning of May 3rd. Kendrick releases 616 in LA, mocking Drake's mythologized survival stories, and then, in one of the most chilling lines ever recorded on a battle track, he informs Drake that there are moles inside OVO. That members of Drake's own inner circle whisper, in private rooms, that he deserves to fail. Now understand what a line like that does to a man built on control. It does not matter whether it is literally true. What matters is that Drake now has to look at every face on his payroll and calculate loyalty in real time. Kendrick had done more than land a punch. He had introduced paranoia into Drake's environment, and paranoia, once introduced into an operation like OVO, cannot be unintroduced. Every meeting after that line was a meeting Drake could not fully trust. Every camera angle, every leaked lyric, every rumor that surfaced in the following weeks, Drake had to filter through the possibility that the leak was internal. That is not a diss. That is a corrosive agent poured into the water supply. Drake, cornered and visibly bleeding, panicked. At 8 in the evening on that same day, he released Family Matters, a nearly 7-minute music video, and he went for the throat. Allegations of domestic abuse against Whitney Alford. Insinuations that one of Kendrick's children did not belong to him but to his business partner Dave Free. Drake thought he had landed the kill shot. He thought he had forced the room to pick a side, and he thought the side would be his. 30 minutes later, Kendrick suffocated him. Meet the Grahams dropped. 6.5 haunting minutes, structured as a personal letter written directly to Drake's family, one member at a time. An apology to Drake's son, Adonis. A scolding aimed at Drake's parents, Sandy Graham and Dennis Graham, for what Kendrick framed as the raising of a sick mind. A direct address to a rumored hidden daughter that the internet had spent years chasing. And a closing statement to Drake himself, itemizing what Kendrick described as private addictions, gambling, drinking, and pharmaceutical dependence. Look at that. In 30 minutes, the frame flipped from a soap opera to a family court transcript. Nothing to it, if you did not know what you were watching. Everything, if you did. It was one of the most jarring tonal pivots in music history, and it was executed with the composure of a lawyer opening a folder in court. This is Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, weaponized at scale for the first time in the modern era of popular culture. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is the part of the self a person hides from the world and, more painfully, from themselves. The repressed, the unadmitted, the underside of the identity that a person spends their life dressing over with performance. Kendrick Lamar acted as an inescapable, planetary-sized mirror, and he held that mirror up in front of Drake's face on a global stage, and he refused to lower it. Every unresolved insecurity Drake had ever buried was suddenly out in the daylight, and there was no room in the room to hide. The Machiavellian, whose entire model depends on managing what the public sees, was standing in a public square, naked, in front of every single person he had ever manipulated. That is not a rap beef. That is a psychiatric event with a beat under it. Drake tried to steady himself the next day with The Heart Part 6. He argued that he had deliberately fed Kendrick fake information about the hidden daughter as a trap. He argued he was in control the whole time. He argued the whole exchange was choreographed on his end. But by then it did not matter what he argued. He was visibly defensive. He was visibly exhausted. The tempo, the composure, the confidence, all of it belonged to Kendrick now. And Kendrick Lamar was ready to deliver the cultural checkmate. He released Not Like Us. A West Coast anthem constructed like a public indictment, that labeled Drake a colonizer and a predator, referencing Drake's long-documented public history with underage girls. The song was not a diss record. It was an ordinance. It did not just win the battle. It united an entire city under a single sentence, and it made that sentence unforgettable. Every child in Los Angeles under the age of 12 could recite that hook within the week. That is not a chart moment. That is folklore. Kendrick performed Not Like Us 5 times in one night at the Pop-Out concert in Los Angeles, surrounded on stage by Dr. Dre, Mustard, and half of West Coast hip-hop history. That was the moment the culture officially chose. The music video for the record was its own act of warfare. Kendrick dancing on camera with Whitney Alford and his children, dismantling Drake's domestic abuse allegations in real time, without saying a single defensive word. The visual said everything the litigation couldn't. It was a love letter to Compton. It was a love letter to survival. It was a love letter to authenticity as a competitive advantage, and it made the counterfeit unmistakable. You cannot manufacture the pain of the streets. You cannot algorithm your way into cultural credibility. Drake grew up acting on a Canadian teen drama in a wealthy Toronto neighborhood. Kendrick grew up watching drive-by shootings from his front lawn. That is not a rivalry. That is a chasm, and Kendrick built a bridge across it out of the bodies of his own trauma, and then he burned the bridge behind him so no one else could ever cross the same way twice. The industry made it official. In February 2025, Kendrick Lamar swept 5 Grammy Awards for a song constructed entirely around a public execution. Song of the Year. Record of the Year. Best Rap Performance. Best Rap Song. Best Music Video. Never before in the history of the Recording Academy has a diss record won those top-line honors. The Academy did not just acknowledge the song. The Academy formally validated the verdict. And then, days later, on February 9, 2025, Kendrick walked onto the biggest stage in American culture, the Super Bowl halftime slot in New Orleans, in front of well over 130 million viewers, and delivered one of the most culturally significant performances in television history. He performed Not Like Us with Serena Williams crip-walking beside him on national broadcast. He did not just win the war. He got paid for it. He got awarded for it. He got immortalized for it, live on network television, in a stadium full of the same executives who had spent a decade insisting that Drake was untouchable. He turned a rap beef into a career capstone, and he did it without ever raising his voice past the register of a man reading a bedtime story to a sleeping child. But here is where most retellings of this story stop, and here is where most retellings of this story are lying to you by omission. Because if you think Drake accepted this defeat, if you think the algorithmic emperor faded quietly into the Toronto skyline, you do not understand the mind of a Machiavellian billionaire. The war did not end. It changed jurisdictions. It moved from the streets to the courtrooms, and it moved because Drake, faced with the mathematical impossibility of winning back the culture, decided the next play was to weaponize the legal system against the machinery that had made the war possible in the first place. Drake sued his own record label, Universal Music Group. He alleged that UMG had knowingly weaponized Not Like Us against him, that the label had promoted, boosted, and marketed the record specifically because it damaged one of their own biggest assets. A federal judge threw the initial case out. Drake's legal team, in 2026, is appealing. Industry chatter, and this is speculation from insider circles, places the settlement number they are chasing north of $100 million. And that raises a question nobody in the mainstream press seems willing to sit with. If Kendrick's stoic patience was enough to dismantle Drake's public image, if the cultural war is truly over, why is Drake still the most streamed artist on the planet in 2026? Why does the audience keep pressing play? Why does the machine keep humming? That question is the fault line, and we are going to stand on it for a moment because it matters more than anything else in this story. When the smoke settles, what happened in the spring of 2024 was not the end of Drake as a commercial force. It was the end of Drake as a cultural authority. Those are two entirely separate ledgers, and the industry is quietly terrified of both of them. Because if streams keep printing while credibility keeps burning, we are watching, in real time, the birth of a new class of artist, the algorithmic ghost, the empire that persists on infrastructure long after the culture has moved on. That is a business model. That is a template. That is a case study every Century City executive is running projections on right now, quietly, without a press release, without a leak, without a single tweet acknowledging what they are staring at on the spreadsheet. Now let us return to the psychology of the man on the winning side, because this is the part every commentator gets slightly wrong. Kendrick Lamar did not win because he was angrier. Kendrick won because he was calmer. Kendrick won because he had already done the internal work that Drake had spent his entire career algorithmically avoiding. When you spend 15 years running from the shadow, and you finally meet a man who spent 5 years sitting with his own shadow in a therapist's office in Los Angeles, the outcome is not a fight. The outcome is a demonstration. Drake did not lose to a rapper. Drake lost to a man who had already survived a version of himself that Drake had never been willing to look at, and that gap, that unwalked interior mile, was the entire fight, before a single bar was ever recorded. And this is the part that should terrify every operator in the modern attention economy. Because Kendrick's playbook is transferable. The bait verse. The controlled silence. The ambush structured as an autopsy. The mirror held up not to punish but to reveal. That framework can be applied to any public figure, any brand, any political operator who has built their identity on a manufactured surface. The reason it works is not tribal, and it is not musical. It works because human beings, when confronted with an accurate portrait of their own shadow held up by someone who has already integrated theirs, cannot argue with it. They can only flinch. And the flinch, on camera, in real time, on the timeline, is the moment the audience makes its decision. That single flinch, captured and repeated, becomes the new default image of the subject. And no marketing budget on earth can outspend a flinch. That is what happened to Drake. He flinched. Publicly. In front of 180 million monthly listeners. And the moment he flinched, the algorithm could not save him, the label could not save him, and the fanbase, however loud and however online, could not rebuild the myth in time. Because myths, once punctured, do not heal. They calcify. They become monuments to the exact moment the audience saw through them. And Drake's monument was Family Matters, the moment he threw every allegation he had, at maximum decibel, and the culture responded by asking, out loud, why he was screaming. That is the moment. That is the flinch. That is the frame that will follow him for the rest of his public life, no matter how many #1 debuts he stacks between now and retirement. Meanwhile, Kendrick was already at the pop-out. Already on the halftime stage. Already writing the next chapter, quiet, composed, unbothered, and one full lap ahead of the industry. And that is the part of the story that will keep getting rewritten in real time for the next decade. Because the Drake collapse is not a single event. It is a case study, and every artist watching it happen absorbed a new understanding of what stoicism, patience, and authenticity can do when they collide with an empire built on manufactured surface. Every young rapper coming up right now is studying that tape. Every publicist in Los Angeles and New York is studying that tape. Every entertainment lawyer in Century City is studying that tape. Every A&R with a client on a major is studying that tape, and quietly rewriting the internal playbook on how to handle a public confrontation when it lands on their artist's doorstep. It has already become the modern equivalent of the Sun Tzu chapter on isolation, except delivered with a Compton accent and a Metro Boomin beat. Understand this, the reason Not Like Us continues to matter in 2026 is not because it is a great song, although it is a great song. It matters because it functions as a permanent psychological watermark. Every time it plays, it relitigates the trial. Every time it plays, the audience is reminded of the moment the shadow was pulled out into the sun. And no marketing budget, no label alignment, no algorithmic push has been able to erase that watermark. Universal has tried. Drake has tried. The lawsuit is, in a very real sense, an attempt to sue a watermark off the internet. It will not work. Watermarks like that do not respond to litigation. They respond only to time, and time, historically, has been the least merciful editor in the culture. Time does not settle out of court. Here is where the analysis gets uncomfortable for the people who have been rooting for Drake to somehow rally. Because there is a school of thought inside the industry, and you will never hear it stated on the record, that says Drake's real mistake was not push-ups, and not tailor-made, and not even Family Matters. Drake's real mistake was not understanding that the moment Kendrick released Like That, the war was already decided. Everything after like that was Kendrick simply confirming the verdict for the audience. Drake spent 49 days trying to argue with a judgment that had already been rendered, and the more he argued, the more he ratified it. That is the cruelty of losing to a stoic. The stoic does not have to prove anything. The stoic just has to wait for the other party to prove it for him. And Drake proved it. Over and over. On his own microphone. With his own money. On his own release schedule. The prosecution never had to enter a single exhibit. Drake did the entering himself. And Drake did. He proved it in real time, on his own platforms, with his own resources, using his own voice. He weaponized his own image against himself, and the audience watched the weapon land. There has never, in the modern history of celebrity, been a self-inflicted wound quite like it. It is the reason the story keeps getting told. It is the reason clips of that weekend still circulate 3 years later. It is the reason a $100 million lawsuit exists. Because on some psychological level, Drake understands what happened to him, and he cannot accept that the machinery that made him is the same machinery that documented his unraveling. That contradiction is the itch under his skin, and no settlement, no matter the number, is going to scratch it out. You cannot pay a lawyer to unflinch on camera. That is not a service the legal system provides. That is not a filing anyone can draft. That is the single injury American celebrity culture has never learned how to bandage, and Drake, of all people, is the one who has to walk the rest of his career carrying it in public view. Now, before we close the file, one more layer, because the story is not done. In 2026, Kendrick is still moving. Not loudly. Not defensively. Moving the way he has always moved, one step ahead, one album quieter, one collaboration more calibrated. His name is being used in headlines about NBA partnerships, halftime negotiations, a rumored boxing-themed concept album with clear Creed and Rocky DNA embedded into the storytelling, film soundtracks in the Ryan Coogler orbit, and quiet meetings inside PG Lang that industry insiders are describing as generation-defining. And every time Kendrick moves, the culture leans forward. That is the residual effect of the Drake War. Kendrick did not just win a battle. He won the permanent attention of a culture that now assumes anything he touches has already been thought about 3 moves deeper than anyone else in the room can see. Baby Keem, Doekiai, and the entire PG Lang roster now operate under that same halo. That is the compound interest on a decisive victory. That is what the winners inherit and the losers spend decades trying to purchase back. Meanwhile, Drake keeps releasing. He released Iceman. He released Maid of Honor. He released Habibti. Each one arrived with the full marketing weight of the largest record label in the world behind it, arrived with billboard placements in every major market, arrived with DJ academics queued up on livestream to validate the launch in real time, and each one hit the charts, and each one dissolved from cultural memory inside a single news cycle. The launches keep landing. The receipts keep printing. The conversation keeps refusing to sustain itself for more than 72 hours. That is not a failure of the algorithm. The algorithm is doing exactly what Drake pays it to do. That is a failure of resonance. And resonance, unlike streams, cannot be purchased. Resonance is what Kendrick has, and resonance is what Drake spent 49 days trying to prove he still owned, and the harder he tried, the more clearly the culture understood that he did not. There is no marketing plan on earth that can install resonance into a catalog after it has evaporated. You either walk in with it or you spend the rest of your career simulating it. So we sit here in 2026, with the appeal filed, with the streaming numbers still favoring the losing side, with a Super Bowl halftime performance already engraved in cultural memory, and with a boxing-themed Kendrick project rumored to be arriving in a shape that no one in the industry has fully mapped. And we are forced to admit that the story we thought was about music was never actually about music. It was about the collision of 2 philosophies of power. One built on presence. One built on saturation. One built on shadow work. One built on shadow avoidance. And in a fair fight, in a public arena, in front of an audience that gets smarter every year, presence always outlasts saturation, and the operator who has integrated his shadow always outlasts the operator who is still running from it. Always. Every time. Without exception. That is not a rap rule. That is a psychological law. That is the file. That is the autopsy. That is what actually happened between March 22, 2024, and February 9, 2025, and what continues to happen underneath the surface of the culture right now, in real time, while you are watching this. Kendrick Lamar did not win a rap beef. He conducted a masterclass in psychological warfare, and he got paid, awarded, and immortalized for it on national broadcast. Drake did not lose a rap beef. He lost his cultural insurance policy, and no amount of algorithmic pressure and no size of legal settlement is going to reinstate it. The mask fell off the moment it mattered, and once the mask falls, no marketing budget in existence is large enough to pin it back on the face. The mask is on the floor. The floor is on camera. The camera is streaming. And the audience has already turned the page. Now, one loop I promised I would leave open, and here it is. If Kendrick's stoicism was enough to dismantle the empire, and if the empire is still the most streamed catalog on the planet, what does that tell us about the audience? What does it tell us about the machinery of streaming itself? What does it tell us about the difference between attention, memory, and belief? Because the algorithm records what you play. It does not record what you respect. And a business model built on the gap between those two things is either the future of the music industry, or the beginning of its slow-motion credibility collapse. That is the conversation nobody in the boardroom is having on the record. That is the conversation this channel is going to keep having, week after week, until somebody with a microphone in a major room is forced to say it out loud. In the next episode of The Unseen Play, we go inside the mind of Drake himself. The algorithmic emperor who refuses to lose. We map the release schedule as a weapon system. We trace the label relationships that make his catalog impossible to move against. We break down why the man who lost the culture is still winning the machines, and what that split reality means for every artist, every executive, and every fan trying to make sense of what the future of music actually looks like. If you thought the war was over, wait until you see the peace treaty he is trying to write with a $100 million signature line at the bottom, and wait until you see who he wants to co-sign it. That is the file we are opening next. That is the room we are walking into. And listen, if you rode this all the way in with me, the like button is the difference between this file spreading and this file dying, and this file deserves to spread. Drop your read in the comments below. Do you believe Kendrick's stoicism was the deciding factor, or do you believe Drake was always structurally doomed by the persona he chose to sell? Which one of Drake's 49-day mistakes do you think was truly the point of no return, push-ups, tailor-made freestyle, family matters, or the tweet-length arrogance underneath all three? And what do you make of the streaming paradox, because that one is going to define the next decade of this industry whether we are ready or not? Tell me what you see. Tell me what the room missed. Tell me which chapter of this you want us to open next. Subscribe to The Unseen Play, because the next episode is going to reframe everything you think you know about the man who lost the culture and still runs the servers. The peace treaty is coming. The empire is still writing checks. And the operator who dismantled it all is quietly building something the industry has not yet learned how to price. Roll the next video on the end screen right now. This story is not finished. It might not ever be. But now, at the very least, you know what you were actually watching all along. You know where the mask fell. You know why it will not go back on. And you know who was 3 moves ahead the entire time. The Unseen Play is the only play that ever mattered. And the operator who saw it first, the surgeon from Compton with a therapist's patience and a chess player's memory, is still, 3 years later, 1 full move ahead of everybody else in the room. Every executive. Every artist. Every algorithm. Every empire built on saturation instead of presence. Every mask still trying to convince the audience it is a face. Kendrick Lamar saw the board first. Kendrick Lamar played the board best. Kendrick Lamar recognized the archetypes, drew the map, set the bait, weaponized the void, delivered the autopsy, and closed the room, all before anyone else in the industry had finished forming an opinion. And Kendrick Lamar is still, quietly, calmly, patiently, moving the pieces the rest of the industry cannot even see are on the table. That is the unseen play. That is why we are here. That is why you and I keep pulling up chairs to look at it one more time. And that is why the next chapter of this story is going to be even bigger than the one we just walked through together. See you in the next file.